Greetings. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this webinar on the global rise of the modern plug-in electric vehicle, public policy, innovation, and strategy. I'm Jonathan Wiener. I'm a professor at Duke University and the co-director of the Duke Center on Risk. And I want to welcome you to this webinar, which is being co-sponsored by the Duke Center on Risk in the Science and Society Initiative and the Duke University Energy Initiative. And we're very grateful to all of those at both the Center on Risk and the Energy Initiative who have made this event possible. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. John Graham, who's the author of the new book on the global rise of the modern plug-in electric vehicle. John Graham is, first and foremost, is a Duke alum. He is currently the professor of risk analysis and decision science and the former dean at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. Before that, he served as dean of the Pardee Graduate School at Rand, and before that, as the administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs within the U.S. Office of Management and Budget from 2001 to 2006. And that was after 2 decades of service at Harvard University, where he was a professor in the Harvard School of Public Health and founding director of the Harvard Center for Risk Analysis. John Graham is the author of numerous books on automobile safety, on risk, on a variety of areas of American public policy. And we're really delighted to have John with us as our featured speaker today. Our conversation with John will be moderated by my colleague at Duke, Professor Laurie Benier. Laurie is the Julie Plant Granger Associate Professor of Energy Economics and Policy at the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University, also with an appointment in economics and public policy. And she previously served as the Associate Director of the Energy Initiative at Duke. She's the author of numerous articles and the book, co-author and editor of the book Policy Shock, Recalibrating Risk and Regulation After Crises. And I had the privilege of working with Laurie on several projects, including a year-long Bass Connections project on adaptive regulation of transportation. So we're so pleased to have both Laurie Benier and John Graham with us today. I'm going to hand it off to John. John, congratulations on your new book. We're eager to hear what you have found and what the future might be for electric vehicles. And then after John gives his presentation, we will have a conversation which Laurie Benier will moderate. I'll note that the link to John's new book is in the chat. And I think Laurie will have further instructions on how people can pose questions. So thank you all. And John Graham, so pleased to have you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Wiener. Thank you so much for Duke University to host this event. I really appreciate it. It is an enormously exciting time in the global auto industry. The world is on the verge of the biggest transition in road transport since the horse and buggy. My theme today is that this transition has less to do with changing preferences of consumers than it does changing preferences of politicians. To illustrate this point, I will explore what is happening in Japan, China, Europe, and the United States. EVs are not a new idea. They lost out to the internal combustion engine in the 1920s and were not seriously reconsidered for another 50 years. Politicians became interested in EVs for several crises of the 1970s, ravaged the economies of the oil importing countries, particularly Japan, the US, Europe, and Japan, Europe, and the US. Politicians see EVs as a source of energy security. Second, politicians seek a solution to unhealthy urban air quality. It began in the 1990s with California's challenge in Los Angeles, the most polluted city in the United States. Third, politicians seek a remedy for one of the biggest contributors to climate change, the greenhouse gas emissions from cars and trucks. And finally, politicians seek a successful industrial policy to accomplish a vibrant automobile sector that delivers jobs, prosperity, and international influence. The shift to EVs is part of a fiercely competitive battle on the future of the global auto industry, and some regions are moving faster than others. And it's crucial to keep all four of these rationales in mind as we ask the question, why are EVs penetrating faster in some areas than others? Now, from the ordinary consumer's perspective, the shift to EVs is hardly a no-brainer. On the positive side, EVs offer acceleration advantages, especially from 0 to 30 miles per hour, and that gives them significant potential in the pickup truck market in the United States. They are simpler and less expensive to maintain. Their operating expenses are lower, and they offer a quieter ride. Without any disadvantages, these advantages would be powerful enough to spell the death of the internal combustion engine. Indeed, with now the spillover of lithium-ion batteries from consumer electronics to the automotive sector, it looks like EVs are much more commercially promising than they have been ever before. But the ordinary consumer is also going to experience some disadvantages with EVs, even when charging stations are as plentiful as gasoline stations. Despite dramatic reductions in battery pack prices, over 80% since 2010, EVs are still more expensive to produce, especially in the booming light truck market, which accounts for about 70% of new vehicle sales in the United States, and for a rising share of sales in Europe, China, and Japan. By light truck, I mean large SUVs, car-like SUVs, minivans, and pickup trucks. The profile and weight of these vehicles means that you need a larger battery pack than you would for a small car or even a mid-sized sedan. And that's what creates part of the expense. Other disadvantages of EVs include less driving range, longer recharging time, uncertain battery life, and lower resale value. The good news for EVs is that innovation is diminishing all of these disadvantages, in some cases quite rapidly. And therefore, between now and 2030, realistically, we have to expect that EVs will be appealing only to a limited number of what we call early adopters in the car business, unless EVs get a big push from politicians. To understand why the global industry is growing so rapidly, at 50% per year right now, we need to have a good understanding of what public policies are doing and how they are boosting EVs. The story of policy interest in EVs actually begins in Japan, where heavy dependence on imported oil led in 1975 to development of the first official national plan to commercialize EVs. With leadership and R&D funding from the Japanese government, prototype EVs with lead-acid batteries were developed and showcased. Research was also authorized in the United States, but the funding didn't really become substantial until the 1990s. As in the 1980s, the decline in world oil prices caused the interest in EVs to wane temporarily. A key turning point was the state of California. They entered the picture in the 1990s, and around 1988, the California regulators started to search for some kind of solution to the air quality problems of Los Angeles. And one of many ideas they developed was to require that all car companies doing business in California to offer a certain number of zero emission vehicles. And by that, they mean zero emission from the tailpipe. The feasibility of this plan was boosted in 1990 when General Motors made an unexpected splash, a pledge to offer the first EV in 50 years to ordinary consumers. Now notice, California was not at this time responding to concerns about global warming. They were addressing acute air quality problems in Los Angeles and a possible loss of federal highway funds for construction projects if they didn't clean up their cities more rapidly. Now, this daring idea to require zero emission vehicles, it started modestly, 2% in the mid-1990s, but it didn't work because battery technology at the time was too primitive to support a commercially appealing electric vehicle. Meanwhile, the European auto industry was moving in a completely different direction. In the 1970s, most European nations raised fuel taxes rather than adopt fuel economy standards as occurred in the US, Japan, and China. Europe also tweaked their fuel prices to favor diesel over gasoline, in part because the diesel engine is more fuel efficient, but in part because German and Italian engine producers had comparative advantages in diesel engine technology. As recently as 2015, more than 50% of new passenger vehicles in Europe were diesels, compared to 10% in Japan and less than 3% in the US and China. As recently as 2005, it looked like EVs were a big loser. Experts in the US and Japan lost confidence in EVs, seeing more near-term promise in hybrids, meaning electric propulsion coupled with a gasoline or diesel engine. Think of the Toyota Prius and its nickel batteries. It was invention of the lithium-ion battery that revived interest in EVs. From 2005 to 2015, several EV milestones were achieved. The Silicon Valley startup Tesla rolled out the impressive Roadster sports car and the upscale Model X and Model S. Nissan launched the first affordable EV, the Leaf, which is now in the hands of 500,000 motorists worldwide. General Motors launched the range-extended Chevrolet Volt. Mitsubishi offered a mini EV as well as one of the best-selling plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. And BMW began an entire line of premium EVs aimed at the mega cities of the world. Despite all of these impressive pre-2015 innovations, consumers were largely uninterested. EVs accounted for less than 1% of the global market in 2015. However, public policy experiments were undertaken in several countries to determine what would you have to do to persuade consumers to shift from the internal combustion engine to EVs. And it turns out that consumers will respond, but the incentives have to be pretty substantial. In Norway, where electricity is cheap, where gasoline costs $7 a gallon, and where politicians wanted to lead on climate change, the Norwegian consumer can save $5,000 per vehicle at purchase by choosing an EV compared to a comparably sized internal combustion engine vehicle. And this doesn't include all the savings in money in energy costs and repair costs during the ownership period of the vehicle. Not surprisingly, from 2010 to 2020, the EV share in Norway's new vehicle market went from 3% to 80% at last measurement. In the United States, Congress enacted a $7,500 tax credit in 2009 for EVs as part of the Obama stimulus package. States like California added their own $2,500 EV rebates, plus access to those very coveted carpool lanes on the freeways of California. In 2020, California's EV share approached 8%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that's triple the US average and one of the highest rates of penetration in the world noting, of course, the exception of Norway. In China, politicians became intrigued with the energy security and industrial policy advantages of EVs well before the environmental rationales were seriously considered. China is 70% dependent on imported oil, largely from the Middle East. Even with their dramatically improved navy, China cannot defend the long sea lanes from the Persian Gulf to the South China Sea. Security officials in China favor a shift in vehicles from oil to coal-fired electricity because China has ample reserves of coal and very little oil. Meanwhile, China's industrial planners were envious of what Toyota had done for Japan's economy, what General Motors did for the United States, and what Volvo did for Germany. China desperately wanted a globally competitive auto industry, and the entire supply chain that is accompanied it. The numerous jobs, the prosperity, the international influence of a global auto industry. From 2010 to 2015, Chinese politicians gradually decided to leapfrog the internal combustion engine and build a new industry based on EV technology. EVs in China have already captured 6% of the huge Chinese new vehicle market. And they did it with some rather distinctive public policies. China had an $8,000 per VE subsidy that started in 10 large cities and then was eventually expanded nationwide. China is now phasing out those subsidies and replacing them with a California-style zero-emission vehicle mandate. The eastern megacities of China were even more enthusiastic about EVs than the central government of China. And they virtually banned cars in the inner city unless they were EVs or the consumer could win a small probability lottery for a license and registration. China's planners, bankers, auto-related companies, and miners also executed a masterful scheme to dominate the supply chain for EVs. China now holds a strong global position in lithium-ion batteries, the components of batteries, by that I mean anodes, cathodes, separators, and electrolytes, and raw materials related processing. For example, lithium and cobalt for batteries and rare earths for electric motors. In 2021, China is a big player in the EV supply chain throughout the world, especially in Asia, Australia, Africa, and South America. Europe and the US are only beginning to compete seriously in the EV supply chain. But Korea and Japan are significant players. The European Union was slow to boost EVs. EU politicians were global leaders on the climate change issue, but they did little actually in the transport sector of Europe to reduce greenhouse gas emissions until the VW diesel emissions cheating scandal in 2015. This scandal created an enormous unexpected boost for the EV industry. The world's biggest automaker, Volkswagen, shifted its entire product planning from diesels to EVs. In addition, VW pledged billions of dollars of subsidy for charging stations throughout the United States and Europe. With the reputation of Germany tarnished in the European Union, European politicians were liberated to impose highly stringent greenhouse gas control standards on the entire European industry. They also adopted new enforcement schemes to make sure the auto companies were meeting their certified values. And in Germany and France and the UK, politicians doubled the subsidies for EVs to entice consumers to be more likely to want to purchase and try out an EV. From 2015 to 2020, the EV share in Western Europe climbed from less than 2% to 15%. In 5 years, Germany accomplished more in EV penetration than California accomplished in 30 years of determined effort. As Europe and China fight for global EV leadership, Japan and the US are beginning to look like anomalies. Japan, however, has already achieved a 35% penetration of conventional hybrids, such as the Toyota Prius. And many Japanese experts believe that HEVs for the next decade are a more cost-effective climate technology than EVs. Japan also has big long-run visions for a hydrogen society that won't rely on batteries or lithium-ion batteries, but there are few fuel cell vehicles on the roads and streets of Japan today. Toyota and Honda are making reluctant investment in EVs for the California and Chinese markets. So reluctant that the new Japanese government is now worried that Japanese industry is falling behind China and the EU in EV development. The US is, of course, the proud home of Tesla, but fewer than 3% of US vehicles are EVs. Half of them upscale Tesla products, many of them sold in California. The Biden-Harris administration campaigned on huge subsidies for EVs, but few details are known yet on what this program will be. Many of the EV startups financed by the Obama administration are now bankrupt. The 4 years of Trump did virtually nothing to advance US EV leadership, and Biden is now rapidly reversing Trump's anti-California policies, with Biden likely to approve California's 2035 plan to achieve 100% EVs. The US appears to be on the verge of a big growth spurt in EVs. Since more than 10 other states are signed on to California's plan, at least 30% of the new vehicle market in the United States is likely to have substantial growth in EVs in the next 15 years, assuming that the consumers are enticed to join this program. In summary, the emerging success of the EV industry is as much a consequence of public policy as a consequence of market forces. Adam Smith would roll over in his grave. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. That's fascinating, and congratulations on your book. And thank you to the Duke Center on Risk and the Energy Initiative for sponsoring this webinar and allowing me to moderate this discussion. So for those of you who are participants here, I'm going to start us off with a few questions. John and I will have a little conversation, and then if you have questions, I'm going to leave time for audience Q&A. So John, you talk a lot about policy as a driver for EVs. I will just say, by casual observation, it seems that consumer preferences are changing in the US, and that it seems almost like we're at the inflection point of that S-shaped diffusion curve at the bottom. As I see Teslas everywhere in my suburban neighborhood, the beginnings of the electric SUV penetration with the Ford Mustang Mach-E, many of my neighbors eagerly awaiting for the electric trucks from Ford, from Rivian, Hummer, a variety of others. So you note in the book that electric vehicles have been around at least since the 1800s. What, if anything, do you think, focusing on the consumer side, is making electric vehicles more popular, or at least more palatable to consumers today, and maybe how that differs across different countries?
Well, there are very, very revealing surveys done in Norway about why Norwegians are buying electric vehicles. And those consumers are very candid. It's not for symbolic reasons. It's not for having a gesture to be pro-environment. It's for economic reasons. And they're saving money, substantial amounts of money, by purchasing EVs. But that's because of the setup of the politicians and how they've allowed that to happen. In Europe, you have a similar kind of story, but coupled with a very hard mandate on the European car industry to deliver low CO2 emission vehicles. So you have pressure on the supply side of the market, you have pressure on the demand side of the market. I think in the United States, it's a little too early to tell how fast this is all going to play out. Keep in mind that virtually all of the offerings of EVs in the United States are premium vehicles, highly expensive vehicles. The average transactions price for a new vehicle in the United States is about $35,000. You can look very hard. You're not going to find very many EVs for $35,000. So until you see some evidence, like there is in China, that you can have affordable EVs that consumers want to buy, it's a little too early to know for sure.
Great. Yeah, my sample may be a little bit skewed here in my North Raleigh suburb on Duke's campus, right? So many people think that, at least in the US, the California policies have been key in the development of electric vehicles. Can you talk a little bit, you spoke a little bit in your opening comments, but what role did California play? And how does that compare to the role of the US federal government or global policies from other countries in terms of promoting electric vehicle development?
Well, California has had a huge impact in several ways. They were there early to try to push the industry to develop electric vehicles. And a lot of the progress made with electric motors and with battery technology was stimulated by California. But you also have to add that the US federal government, through the Department of Energy, made major decade-long investments in the technologies that we're now seeing come into electric vehicles, the lithium-ion batteries and other components of the systems. So the federal government has also played a substantial role. But the second way California makes a big difference is right now. They have legal requirements right now. If you're going to do business in California, you have to have a strategy to get electric vehicles into that market. And obviously, all the industry wants to sell vehicles in the lucrative California market, as well as all those other states that are aligned with California. So that is a hugely important factor. The third way they've been important is they've developed close relationships with the Chinese government. And now you have the Chinese modeling the California zero emission vehicle mandate. You cannot imagine a bigger impact that California could have had, in spite of the fact that the Trump administration did their best to take California out of the business.
Thank you. So I remember, we were talking about climate policy back in the 90s during the Kyoto Protocol negotiations. And then even in the early 2000s, there was a lot of angst about what would happen if China, Brazil, India all ended up having, their own cars, right, and air conditioners, if they ended up having the sort of carbon consumption of the US or Western Europe. You talked, you have a DICE chapter in the book on China, and you talked a little bit about China in your introductory comments. China has had this more aggressive approach on EVs, but at the same time paired with coal-fired electricity. Is it the case that China's push to EVs will actually be greener or more environmentally friendly if they're relying on coal, or do we expect to see them moving away from coal as they develop more electric vehicle infrastructure?
Well, one thing to keep in mind, Lori, is the primary driver behind the EV industry is not climate policy in China. Okay, it is first and foremost the idea of getting off oil for security reasons, and also the desire to leapfrog the internal combustion engine for industrial policy reasons. Now, the other aspect of this is Western delegations of experts who have gone to China and inspected their new coal-fired power plants. They're now approving dozens of new plants, more than are retired each year. But when they look at these plants, they are extremely innovative and clean from a smog and soot perspective. And this may really have a tremendous positive environmental value in the big cities of China. However, they don't yet have carbon capture and sequestration. They don't have controls on carbon dioxide and the other greenhouse gases. So it remains to be seen how China will try to reconcile their commitments to be an international participant in greenhouse gas control with their commitment to EVs and coal. I think one final point on that is that you got to remember that the Chinese, they They will talk a lot about issues in terms of how they are aligned with various policy objectives. But as the present time, unless you can find carbon capture and sequestration, it's hard to see how China's coal future is aligned with a climate change solution.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It's interesting to think about the difference between the climate impacts, the CO2 impacts of electric vehicles versus the local air pollution impacts.
Right.
In the book and in your comments, you talked also in California, that was one of the original motivators, right? It wasn't actually about climate policy, it was about smog in Los Angeles. So, and they don't always, those two things don't always run in parallel. So speaking of the green, are electric vehicles green, right? So some people will argue that they're not necessarily as green as we might think they are. You talked about how when we say zero emissions vehicles, we mean zero emissions from the tailpipe, right? But of course we have to get the electrons that are charging those vehicles from somewhere. And it matters what the generation source is for how green those are. Plus, the products that are used in the lithium ion batteries and other components of the batteries are often found in places that are maybe not the most politically stable or good on human rights issues or other things. So as we think about both the environmental impacts of EVs and maybe the social justice impacts of EVs, how green are they? How good are they? And do you expect that to change over time?
Well, I think that progress is being made, but there's a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done to make the EV supply chain sustainable, or at least just environmentally and human rights respectable. And there's a lot of work being done at this present time. NGOs are working on these issues, governments are working on these issues, but there should be no sweet talking about this, because if you look all through that supply chain, you have very energy intensive industries that are generating greenhouse gases of their own and other forms of pollution. You have the batteries themselves. In a lot of countries, we don't have good plans for what to do with these batteries when their viability in the vehicle is no longer, when there is no longer any viable use in the vehicle. And so plans are being developed like that. And right now the European Union is developing a very ambitious regulation called the Battery Directive. But the bottom line of that is going to be, it's going to be more expensive to generate batteries that meet this directive, which of course cuts against the desire to bring down those battery prices so the vehicles are more affordable for lots of people. So there are lots of trade-offs in this aspect of the issue. But I think that there is a tremendous amount of energy, government, industry, and NGOs being put into making the EV sector more sustainable.
Yeah. So this leads to a question that we got from an audience member. Alan Roberts asked, he says, there's numerous articles recently about the environmental and geopolitical costs for lithium ion battery production, and few are discussing the recycling and waste costs. Are we rushing ahead of battery pack economics as we push the electric vehicle market without knowing what to do with the waste on the other end?
Well, that's of course exactly what the European Union is worried about, and the two initiatives in Europe right now that are addressed on that issue is they are trying to develop a European-based manufacturing industry for lithium-ion batteries. Some of it will be supplied by Asian suppliers, but a lot of the actual production of lithium cells and lithium modules and packs will be done in Europe. The US has a modest effort in this area as well, but it's important to keep in mind the relative scales in all this, and what's going on in China and in Asia generally is massively in excess of what you're seeing in Europe and the US. Is it going too fast? I think it's hard to generalize, because you could make a lot of arguments that in the US it's going a little bit too slowly. You could make an argument it might be going a little bit too fast in Europe. And China has been steady and determined. And this reminds me of a key point to understand about the differences of both Chinese and Japanese science policy culture, if you will. It has a lot of continuity. They make decade-long or 20-year commitments, and then they stick it out and they keep working on it and working on it. Whereas the United States has a tendency to go kind of ping-ponging back and forth between different types of issues. I worked for George W. Bush. He was deeply interested in hydrogen fuel cell vehicles and a hydrogen society. That's what Japan wants now. Korea wants that as well. But a lot of the rest of the world wants to do electric vehicles, lithium-ion based battery electric vehicles. Then we get a new president, President Obama. He wanted to move more toward electric vehicles in the California style solution. It's a lot easier to move a big complex economy when you have a Japanese or Chinese style political system. And even though they're very different in their own ways, in science and technology policy, they're very similar in the sense that they have a lot of continuity in what they're trying to accomplish.
Right, a lot of centralization of industrial policy that we tend to resist much more strongly in the United States.
Right, right.
So you also talked in the book a fair amount about the grid and integrating electric vehicles into the grid. You know, on the consumer side, we hear a lot about range anxiety, that one of the hesitations for adopting an EV is you are afraid you'll run out of juice somewhere too far from a charging station. But there are also significant impacts for electric utilities in terms of providing the infrastructure and the power to support the electric vehicle expansion. So can you talk a little bit about what remaining steps are necessary to ensure the full integration of EV charging into the electric grid, I guess in the US?
Right. Well, I mean, and the challenge is similar in many ways around the world. But one thing to keep in mind is that you don't want to have a solution that relies heavily on people using public charging stations. The electricity prices in these public charging station venues can be double and triple what they are for residential electricity prices. And that undercuts one of the most significant tangible rationales for consumer to purchase an electric vehicle. So you want them predominantly to be using home and workplace charging, which will be relatively inexpensive, and then only on occasionally when absolutely necessary using the public charging. This is going to get even worse as it's becoming apparent to the automakers that an 80% charge within 30 minutes isn't good enough for most consumers. They want a better deal than that in terms of charging fast. They want ultra fast charging. Now they're looking at 80% in 8 minutes or 10 minutes or 12 minutes. But that means that the electricity to generate that, it's much bigger demands on the electric power sector. The peak demands will be higher and the price of the electricity is likely to be higher. So there's a lot of work to be done on the coordination of the transition to EVs between the electric power industry, the auto industry, and the consumers. And frankly, it's one of the most exciting areas to do work right now because there's a lot of very tangible problems that are being worked on. And a lot of them are very solvable, but they require creative people to work hard, and that's what's happening.
Great. I'm going to pop over to the Q&A for a little bit because we have a couple of really interesting policy questions there. So Brian Murray asks, what are your thoughts on the proper role of the US federal government on EV charging station build out? The Biden administration has called for 500,000 new charging stations, but one normally thinks of fueling as a private sector endeavor and drivers presumably must pay for the charge. How can the government literally move the needle here?
Well, it's a fabulous question. And one of the reasons is that there are several very highly successful private companies who are involved in supplying EV charging services, not only in the US, but around the world. And some of these companies are involved in this huge run up in share prices of electric vehicle related companies. So the way the federal government does this has to be very careful because you could inadvertently actually squelch a substantial amount of a private industry that's already developed. And let's face it, in the long run, this needs to be done by the private sector. And it needs to be done for people who pay for the service so that the quality of service is there. One of the things that's happened in China is they had this massive build out of charging stations, government directed. And it turned out that, first of all, the locational decisions on a lot of these public charging stations in hindsight were maybe not as good as they could have been. A lot of them are basically, they lay there unused for long periods of time. And second of all, if you're doing this type of thing, like at a shopping mall, there's not necessarily anybody who has a strong stake in kind of maintaining this equipment and making sure the quality of service is high. But if it's a private provider, they're offering a service and the consumers are paying for it, then you have the potential matchup So I think the Biden administration is definitely correct that there is a need for stimulus on the charging sector side. I mean, you have the chicken and egg problem. People won't buy electric vehicles until they're charging stations, and investors won't invest in charging stations until there are consumers buying electric vehicles. These solutions are not easy to solve, and so they're right to be working on the problem, but it needs to be done carefully in a way that doesn't actually hurt the development of the private sector.
Great, thank you. From Claudine Schneider, we have, since much of your message relates to policy, as a former US Congresswoman and member of the Science, Research, and Technology Committee, what are you doing basically to get the message out, to testify before Congress, speak to former members, National Council of Mayors, get on 60 Minutes NPR, reach beyond those that are already in the choir, which she assumes is most of us today, which is probably right.
Yes.
How do we move these ideas into action as soon as possible?
Right. Well, I think that one of the things that's going on right now is kind of a huge, in the United States, is a huge experiment in California and the states that are aligned with California. And I think one of the key strategic decisions that the Biden administration needs to make is how much do you want to try to force this transition at the federal level, and how much do you want to kind of let California lead and then adapt nationally based upon what you learn from California's experience. And my instincts tell me that the Biden administration should let California lead for a while and see how things go, rather than to force some kind of uniform solution across the country. There may need to be some development of the industry and some support of the industry that will be nationwide. But in terms of the mandates for EVs, I think maybe that's best left at the state level for now until we learn more about how the US consumer is going to react to all this.
Great. I'm going to do one more on policy from the audience and then switch topics from the audience questions. So from Betsy Albright, we have, thank you for your thoughtful, engaging presentation. Congrats on your book. My question, do you see tension in the uptake of EVs and investment in public transit? Do you believe government incentives and policies that support EVs will replace investments in mass transit infrastructure?
Great question. And in the book, I addressed what we've learned in Norway, and it is a big trade-off. The big growth in electric vehicles has hurt ridership on public transit, and it's hurt revenues for the public transit systems. And I think that for U.S. policymakers concerned about those issues, they should look carefully at the Norwegian experience. To give just one small anecdote, one of the things they found in Norway is the deal to buy an electric vehicle was so juicy that some households just bought an extra vehicle. They didn't replace the current vehicles they had. And they bought this little extra toy and they used it occasionally. And some of them used it regularly for commuting rather than the public transit systems. So there is already a lot of experience telling us. Now, if you go to China, you've had two things happen. You had the SARS outbreak and then you had COVID. And both of these experiences are really turning consumers off of public transit. The notion of a private motorized vehicle in China is enormously valued. And not just for the reasons that it's always been valued in the US, but because it's a major health issue and people not wanting to access highly dense public transit arenas. So I think it's going to be very hard in a country like China to really get the public transit solution back on track. And therefore, these very inexpensive EVs that are now being offered, not only by Chinese automakers, but by General Motors through their partners, these like $4,000 very small EVs, sort of golf cart size like EVs, they're a very important part of the solution of the transport problem in China.
Great. All right, we're going to switch gears from policy to a bunch of technology questions that we have going on here in the Q&A. So one question from Eduardo Guerra is, the stress of EVs on utilities will demand significant infrastructure upgrades paid by ratepayers. Would you consider fuel cell electric vehicles as part of the solution to diversify transportation? And what would be the right policy levers, incentives, carbon tax, et cetera?
Well, the hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles definitely should be part of portfolio. One of the worries I express in the book is this idea that we're just going to roll the dice and we're going to put all of our marbles on lithium-ion batteries or the next generation of lithium-ion batteries. It's important to have several different technologies in play, and some of them are going to have better opportunity. For example, the hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles, they may do better in the commercial truck market and the heavy truck market before they penetrate into the light duty passenger market. But in any event, we still want to have multiple options in play to see where the innovation is the most promising. So I definitely agree with that.
Great. And Mark Vasu asks about well, I'll just read the whole thing. Affordable and prevalent EVs mean reducing its cost, and particularly reducing the cost of the battery. The US is embarrassingly behind in battery manufacturing and building its own supply chain. We have 4 gigafactories. China has nearly 100 gigafactories. The European Battery Alliance is leading in developing its supply chain. The EU attracted more investment last year than in China. What do you think it will take for the US to catch up and build an effective value chain, or can we?
Well, it's a great question. Governments are not great venture capitalists, and this is the challenge you have in trying to build a new industry like this. In fairness, the Obama administration made major investments in the development of a supply chain for batteries and for electric vehicles. The problem was the consumer didn't respond very well to either the Nissan Leaf or the Chevrolet Volt, which were supposed to be the affordable mainstream vehicles that consumers would buy. So now you have all these companies, they built these plants, they're ready to produce these batteries, and there aren't any people buying the electric vehicles. Now, the situation in Europe is different because the government is forcing the development of the electric vehicles. So you're assured that there are going to be electric vehicles there for people to purchase, and the same in China. So this is, and you actually said it yourself, Lori, it's very out of character for the US government to engage in that heavy of a government forcing of a particular technology in a particular industry. So the version that you're likely to get out of the United States is something like this, coming from California and allied states, and then seeing how it works before it goes nationwide.
Great, thank you. Abhishek Jane asks, what role will EVs play as DERs, distributed electricity resources? Would they be an asset or a liability to the grid?
Wow, that's a great question, and definitely above my pay grade. I mean, I'm here in Indiana, we're just trying to get our act together to make sure we have big enough large-scale electricity systems to make things happen. But the growth of wind and solar are particularly crucial in the long-term sustainability of the electric vehicle. I mean, the whole underlying premise here is it's going to be easier to control greenhouse gas emissions from centralized electric power facilities than it is to try to control them on tens of millions of small motorized vehicles. Now, distributed energy resources are a little different than that, and they're kind of a permutation of both. So I would say definitely yes, but a lot of work needs to be done to make sure that marriage works effectively.
Great. And then William Stewart asked a question. I was going to ask you about fleets as well, but we've been talking a lot about consumer vehicles, right? Like the Tesla or the Volkswagen or the Nissan Leaf. What do you anticipate the use of this technology for road trucks, is William's question, or for fleets? So the sort of Amazon trucks that, do the last mile delivery. Is that an area where we're likely to see penetration more quickly or more slowly, and why?
Well, in China, what we've learned is that the penetration in that market was particularly rapid. And in Europe, where company cars are a big percentage of all new vehicles sold each year, that has been a big source of the rapid growth. But in the US market, where the fleet sales are roughly in the 20% territory. Automakers, they want to sell their new vehicles to the retail consumer because that's where the margins are highest. If you have trouble selling your vehicle in the retail market, then you dump it in the fleet market, because the fleet buyers are very sophisticated and they follow prices very closely, and you're not going to make nearly as much money in the fleets. Can the government and business fleets be turned to electric vehicles quickly? The government fleets certainly more rapidly, but it turns out that fleet managers on the private sector side, they are much more dollar and cents oriented, not emotional purchasers like a lot of retail purchasers are. You might find it easier to sell EVs to get the industry going in the US to some more emotionally and passion-oriented buyers than you will fleet buyers. Now, if the price of the new EV comes down enough that the total cost of ownership is lower for the EVs, then the fleet buyers will respond quickly. But by that point, you probably got the market breakthrough anyway. So the fleet buyers in the US are helpful, but they're not a solution by themselves.
So merging two of my favorite topics, electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles. We have a question here. We're already seeing the convergence of EVs and autonomous vehicles, not fully autonomous, but Tesla at least claims, although as an owner of a Tesla, I will tell you it's not that great, that they have self-driving capabilities. How will the development of autonomous vehicles and their integration into the market influence electric vehicles and the policy surrounding them? Or are they really two separate things?
Well, it's a great question. And the first point would be around 2010, if you go back and look at a lot of the claims being made, both kind of marketing claims and technical claims, the idea is you would have the autonomous vehicles and the electric vehicles kind of emerging in tandem. And I think in fairness, we have to acknowledge that electric vehicles are commercializing faster than fully autonomous vehicles. So yes, there's a lot of partial autonomous capabilities in vehicles that is being commercialized. But the notion of fully autonomous vehicles being on a mass basis, I think we're still realizing, that's going to be a good while before we're ready for that, because the technology has to be enormously dependable in order to withstand, in this country at least, if you can imagine the kinds of lawsuits that would occur for even a relatively small number of adverse events. But even around the world, you're not seeing a fully autonomous vehicles coming that quickly. Now, where you will see them potentially initially would be in the fleet market and in certain urban delivery markets where there are very well-defined routes, centralized stopping points, and so forth and so on. So yes, we will see the autonomous vehicles, but my feeling is we know now, which we didn't know 10 years ago, that electric vehicles are going to happen faster than fully autonomous vehicles.
Yeah, that would be my sense too. Even 5 years ago, I was much more bullish on the speed at which AVs would make it into the market. But and my daughter, who is now 14, thought she wasn't going to have to learn to drive, but she will. So things will not go quite as quickly. So I had another question for myself, and now I've forgotten it. So I'll ask one from the audience again. It says, I'm very passionate on electric vehicles and the infrastructure. Please let me know, what are your thoughts about this question that came across my way? What could a small family-owned gas stations do to transition out of selling petroleum-based fuels when they're limited to long-term investments and have low access to funding?
That's a great question. I just saw recently, by the way, that in Germany, they're actually putting requirements on gasoline stations that they have to make a certain amount of investment in electric charging stations as well. So the regulation is being used with the stick to try to make this happen in Germany. I don't see that happening in the United States in quite the same way. But I think it remains to be seen whether the gasoline station market is actually evolve similarly for charging stations. Because a lot of people in the gasoline station business, they do offer gasoline, but their profitability is often with the extras and everything else you buy when you stop and make your gasoline stop. So the question becomes then, is there some analog that in the charging sector? And that's still not entirely clear. One area where the government is getting in the way of the charging system development is along interstate highways, where one of the most natural places to put these electric charging would be rest area, but that's by law. Retail purchasing is allowed except a small number of vending machines and so forth. So we're going to need to have a rethink on whether we're willing to dedicate part of our interstate highway system to the transition to electric vehicles.
Great. I remembered my question. So the US subsidy, as opposed to the European subsidies and the Chinese subsidies, was done by manufacturer. So that when a manufacturer reaches a certain level of sales, there's no more subsidies. You can't get a subsidy on a Tesla anymore. So what was the rationale for that? And do you think that was a good approach or not a good approach? And what impact does that have on US adoption of EVs?
Well, my recollection of the history of that is the $7,500 tax credit started out with a cap on 200,000 EVs industry-wide. Then they changed it to make it more liberal, more easy to get subsidies by saying it was 200,000 units per manufacturer. So it was definitely in the mode of trying to expand the total number. Now, maybe they should have just kept the concept of the industry cap and then relaxed the industry cap. That would be a great little project for one of the policy analysis students at Duke. But it looks to me like they're continuing down this path of trying to keep this per manufacturer concept going. And I don't know that it has that good of a policy rationale, but you can imagine the politics of it are enormously thick. Because you're effectively choosing one company versus the other when you tweak these things in their design and their structure.
Yeah. So this is an interesting question from the audience. How is the used car market factored into the overall electric vehicle market, both from the battery technology and the cost, where it may make access much easier in the long run potentially, or much more difficult if we don't know how well the batteries will last?
Yes, well, the one thing to keep in mind is we don't have a large scale experience with these lithium ion batteries in the second half of the vehicle life. So we really don't know yet what the rate of failure of batteries is going to be. And if it is significant, the price for replacement of those batteries is quite substantial, $5,000 to $10,000 range for replacing these batteries. And even in the Tesla, where there are separate modules, you don't have to replace the whole battery, you can replace a module, but a module replacement is a $7,000 proposition in the Tesla vehicles. So I think that the battery replacement issue is a big deal. And that's one of the reasons that a lot of the sales, so-called sales of electric vehicles, are leases. So people purchase them on a lease arrangement for 3 years, and then they have the opportunity, if they want, after 3 years, to get a different EV that has longer range and better technology and so forth and so on. I still think you're going to see a substantial amount of leasing in the electric vehicle market in the US until some of these things are sorted out. One final comment about what a lot of this means for the low income consumer, who is predominantly a used car purchaser and user. A lot of those people don't have places for charging stations. They don't have garages. They don't have a place where you can, at home, where you can charge them up. A lot more serious thinking is going to need to be done of how low income Americans can participate in the transition to electric vehicles. And some of the early efforts, for example, California is ahead on this as well. They're finding that even if you provide bigger subsidies for low income households, the prices of these vehicles are still pretty substantial. They're really not realistically in the zone for low income households. So then are we talking about subsidies for used electric vehicles? Why do we only have subsidies for new electric vehicles? And I think the environmental justice community in the Biden administration, as we speak today, is pounding the table on those kinds of issues. This whole thing sounds like a big subsidy for Tesla-like buyers or Ford Mustang buyers, and these are not low-income Americans.
Great. Well, we have 1 minute left, so I thought maybe I would give you a chance to look into your crystal ball. I don't know if yours is as blurry as mine is lately, but and think about what do you think going forward are the biggest possible factors that would influence the rate of adoption of electric vehicles, and is there anything that could happen that would significantly slow or accelerate the rise of EVs?
Well, the book gets into a lot of that and probably more details than people want to hear. The one thing I want to point out to people is if you look at the Chinese market and you compare it to the United States market for electric vehicles, the thing that's most striking is there are electric vehicles available in China at numerous price points, all the way down to $4,000. Now, a lot of Americans are not going to want to buy these vehicles, but until the United States market gets some affordable electric vehicles that ordinary consumers want to purchase, the transition will be slow. One way to think about this, Tesla is sort of the BMW of electric vehicles. They're not yet in the market for mainstream ordinary people. And BMW has been very profitable for decades just doing that part of the market. Tesla can sustain profitability in that area, but that's not going to bring mass commercialization of electric vehicles. Somebody has to figure out a way to do an affordable electric vehicle in the US and make money doing it.
Great. Well, thank you so much, John, for this really thought-provoking webinar. I'm sorry to the members of the audience that if I didn't quite get to your question, I got to as many as I could in our time, but this is a topic topic that I know a lot of people are really interested in. And so we had just an absolute ton of great questions. But again, join me in thanking our speaker, John Graham, and the Duke Center on Risk and the Energy Initiative for hosting us today.